Hi, it's Pastor Andy with our Tuesday discipleship video this week. And the greatest passage in the Bible on humility is found in Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11. It discusses the humility of Jesus, who gave up everything that he had, all the privileges that he could afford as the Son of God, and came to live as a human, let alone to die as a human. He gave his life for us, even as he himself is God. Now, that example cannot be matched by anyone, anywhere, at any time. However, that passage in Philippians 2, 5 through 11, being the greatest, is then followed by two other passages that talk about humility. In chapter 2, in the remainder of chapter 2, we have the examples of Timothy and Epaphroditus, who both gave up of their own rights, their own sacrifices, because of the care and compassion of others. Epaphroditus even being ill and showing his compassion towards the people of Philippi, being recorded just a few verses after what was shared about Jesus. And then when we get into chapter 3, we have Paul and his example of humility, not right away, as he was sharing all of the things that he had achieved because of being born of the tribe of Benjamin and becoming a great Pharisee and one of the Pharisees that had the most promise in the day. And yet, what Paul realized ultimately, that he would throw all that away because it's not what he achieved, it's what he received. So as we think about that humility, we see humility represented by Paul in Romans 16:22. And that verse simply says, I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord. Now, you might read that and say, Andy, what do you mean by humility? But I think when I explain this to you, you're going to appreciate the humility that Paul had here. As I mentioned in Sunday's message, Romans 16:22 simply mentions the name of a man, Tertius, as the one who actually wrote down the content of this letter. Now, we don't know anything else about this man. His name means third, like the third, as in Andy Braams the third, if there were three of me, the third generation of me. But he is an amanuensis. He is someone who writes for other people. And this was very common in the day. Many rich people didn't want to write because, well, we can have other people do that for us. Many poor people had other people write for them because they didn't know how to read or write. So it was a very, very common profession for someone to be an amanuensis, or, as we might say, a scribe for other people. For Paul, I believe the issue was likely his eyesight. In fact, I truly believe that may have been his thorn in the flesh. We can't know for certain, but 2 Corinthians 12:7 talks about the thorn in the flesh, and Galatians 6 talks about him writing in his own hand with such large print. I think his eyesight may have been a reason he may have asked others to write on his behalf. Now, regardless of why somebody may have written this letter, Tertius wrote this letter. And sometimes the amanuensis would be someone who would be given some general directions. Say, this is what I want you to write, put it in your own words, and do that for me. In the sermon on Sunday, I mentioned Alexander Hamilton, and Alexander Hamilton did that kind of thing for George Washington during the war, the Revolutionary War. But because of the contents of Romans, and how specific it is, and the background that it has, and Paul's background as a Pharisee, this letter was likely dictated to Tertius. And some might say that, again, Paul didn't write this letter because he had somebody else write this letter. Some might question whether or not Paul should have paid somebody to do this, but we don't know that Paul paid this person. We simply know that he wrote the letter. He might have been doing this as a service for the Lord. But what we do know is that Paul is the architect of this letter, and as the architect, he steps back. Here's the humility. He steps back and allows Tertius to identify himself, which would not have been common at all. And not only did he allow him to identify himself as the writer, but also to express a greeting to the church at Rome. Now, this is even more amazing to me in the fact that Paul had never been to Rome. So his credibility is on the line. If he said that I, the apostle, wrote this letter, or if it was just inferred that he had written this letter, there would have certainly been credibility. But now somebody might say, well, Paul didn't really write this. How do we know that Tertius wrote what Paul wanted to have been written? In fact, many people today make that very argument. As much as that might seem reasonable, again, given the day, given the culture of the day, this was not an unordinary or out of the ordinary task. So Tertius wrote it. He may have even been from Rome. He may have known people in Rome, and so it might have added a personal touch. But regardless, Paul's humility allowed him to say, go ahead, share your name, share your greeting. I think it's great. Paul was very bold in his writing, but Paul was humble. He knew the value of others, and he wanted them to know their value as well. Thus, this act of humility, in this act of humility, he not only had Tertius record that he was the writer, but likely may have even encouraged him to include this note of greeting as well. So, the lesson for us in this is, who do you know that might need some encouragement? What could you do to encourage them, to give them credit, even when maybe you deserve more of the credit yourself? Especially when we are recognizing somebody who is laboring for the purposes of God. Let us not only give credit where credit is due, but sometimes let us allow credit to be had by those it would help more than if we receive the credit ourselves.